I was still working when my boss cut me off mid-task and told me to pack up, effective immediately. No warning, no discussion, just a petty rule and a smug smile. I walked out quietly, but something far bigger was already in motion. By the next morning, numbers stopped moving, reports went dark, and people who ignored me for years started dialing my phone nonstop. If you've ever been punished over something small while executives abuse their power, hit like, subscribe, and stay with me. Because this didn't end the way they expected. The week before everything blew up, my calendar filled itself without anyone asking. A finance director forwarded an email marked urgent asking why renewal totals didn't match cash forecasts, and I replied with a corrected dashboard that forced accounting to reissue numbers before their executive review. Sales operations scheduled a meeting to complain about stalled contracts, and I walked them through a billing rule they'd been overriding incorrectly, which stopped 3 more deals from breaking. An automated alert flagged duplicate invoices going out to enterprise clients, so I disabled the trigger, sent a notice to legal, and prevented what would have turned into refunds and angry calls. None of this was dramatic. No applause, no thank you emails, just quiet fixes that kept money moving and problems invisible. During a revenue sync, my boss spoke for 10 minutes about discipline and optics, then looked straight past me while approving a policy update that rerouted approvals through a team that didn't have access to the systems involved. I sent a follow-up email outlining the risk, attached screenshots, and asked for a short review. The response was silence, followed by the policy going live anyway. By the end of that day, customer support opened 5 tickets tied to the same change, and I closed all of them manually while leadership discussed branding slides in another room. A junior analyst pinged me asking why her reports no longer matched leadership numbers, and I sent her a private explanation she wasn't supposed to need yet. Procurement asked whether a vendor delay would affect revenue recognition, and I confirmed it would unless I adjusted the rules before month end. I made the adjustment. Nothing escalated because I handled it before it could. The systems did exactly what they were designed to do, and everyone assumed that meant nothing was happening. When my boss finally scheduled a one-on-one, it wasn't to ask how any of it worked. It was to remind me about policy adherence, optics, and the importance of following the chain of command. I acknowledged the message, forwarded him the latest revenue snapshot he'd need for his update, and watched him present it later as if it appeared on its own. My boss didn't raise his voice when he stopped beside my desk, which somehow made it worse. He tapped the surface once with a knuckle, looked at what I was doing, then at the small snack I had set, off to the side, and told me to step into the conference room. He didn't ask. Inside, HR was already seated with a folder open, and security hovered near the door pretending to check their phones. He said I had violated workplace policy and set a poor example, that standards mattered and exceptions led to chaos. I asked which policy, and he slid a printed page across the table with a line highlighted so aggressively it tore the paper. Food belongs in designated areas. He said this was about professionalism, not performance, and that the decision had already been approved. HR avoided eye contact while reading from a script about restructuring and operational alignment. I pointed out that I was in the middle of resolving a billing discrepancy tied to active contracts, and he waved it off, saying someone else would handle it. I asked who. No answer. He said the company needed people who followed rules without friction. Security took a step closer. I was told to surrender my badge and laptop immediately. I asked about transition or documentation, and he said we'd figure it out later. When I stood up, he reminded me not to make a scene, as if I were the one escalating things. At my desk, 2 people watched quietly while I packed personal items into a box someone else had already grabbed. My access dropped before I finished, screens locking one by one, alerts cutting off mid-refresh. A message from finance came through asking for confirmation on numbers for an executive call, then vanished as the system logged me out. Security walked me past the open floor, past people still typing, past a manager laughing on a headset about quarterly wins. My boss didn't follow. He stayed behind, already moving on, already treating the decision as settled. In the lobby, HR handed me a final page to sign acknowledging receipt of termination materials, not agreement, just receipt. I signed, kept a copy, and asked where to return my parking pass. The guard took it instead. Outside, the doors slid shut behind me with a soft click that felt deliberate. I pulled my phone out before reaching the sidewalk and opened my contacts. There was one number I hadn't needed in years, not because it wasn't important, but because it was only for situations like this. I hit call, watched it ring once, and said the words that made everything irreversible. I was terminated without cause, effective immediately, and I needed to proceed. The call didn't take long to connect, and when it did, I didn't explain the story or justify anything. I stated facts. Terminated without cause, immediate revocation of access, no transition. The response on the other end was quiet, then deliberate. I was asked to forward the termination notice and the signed acknowledgement. I did it before the elevator in the building across the street finished its cycle. While we waited for the documents to load, I was told to sit tight and not engage with anyone from the company, no matter how urgent they made it sound. A few minutes later, the line picked back up and the tone changed from neutral to precise. The contract was still valid. The language was still enforceable. The provision was exactly where it had been when it was negotiated, untouched by revisions that came later because no one had bothered to rework it. I was reminded why it existed in the first place. I had built core revenue systems before the company could afford a full team, under an agreement that allowed them to use my work only while I was employed in good standing. Termination without cause triggered an option, not an automatic event, an option that belonged entirely to me. I was asked a single question. Did I want to proceed? I said yes. Instructions followed immediately. A notice would be drafted and filed. Once filed, continued use of the systems would expose them to penalties they couldn't ignore. I was told to expect pushback, confusion, and attempts to frame this as a misunderstanding. I was also told not to argue. Let the paper speak. After the call ended, I sat where I was and watched messages stack up on my phone without opening them. A manager from sales asking if I was okay. A finance analyst asking whether numbers could be finalized without me. A calendar invite from my boss marked tentative, as if the situation were still flexible. I did nothing. I forwarded one message to my attorney, the one where legal asked me to call them immediately, and was told that was expected. The notice went out shortly after, concise and unemotional, citing section numbers and obligations, nothing more. There was no accusation, no threat, no explanation of consequences beyond what the contract already stated. From that point forward, the clock belonged to them. I didn't wait around to see what would happen. I closed the laptop I had brought with me and moved to a public place where no one could corner me. When I opened my computer again, it wasn't to monitor systems or check alerts. It was to pull up the dashboards I had access to independently, the ones designed for validation and auditing, not daily operations. They were still live. I watched activity slow, then stall, not everywhere at once, but in clusters that told a clear story. Approvals didn't propagate. Billing runs paused halfway through. Renewals queued without processing. The systems weren't crashing. They were doing exactly what they were configured to do when authorization disappeared. My phone started buzzing again, louder this time. Missed calls, voicemails left without details, then with urgency, then with frustration. I didn't listen. I wasn't required to. An email came through from an executive distribution list I had never been part of before, asking whether there was a known outage and who owned resolution. I marked it unread. Another message followed asking if anyone had documentation for the revenue logic tied to renewals in 3 major accounts. No one replied. I ordered a drink I didn't. Really want and watch people walk past carrying bags and laptops, having no idea what was happening inside a company that depended on numbers behaving a certain way to appear stable. The first official escalation arrived through counsel, formal and carefully worded, requesting a discussion about ongoing operations and mutual interests. The reply went out just as carefully, acknowledging receipt and reiterating the notice already filed. Nothing else. By then, the shift had already happened. The silence wasn't confusion anymore, it was calculation. They were starting to understand that this wasn't about a snack or policy or optics. It was about control, and the fact that they no longer had it. The first sign that panic had replaced confusion came through other people, not screens. A former teammate sent a single line asking if I was seeing what they were seeing, followed by a screenshot of a revenue dashboard frozen mid-cycle with figures that didn't reconcile. I didn't respond. Another message came in from someone in customer success saying 3 enterprise clients were on hold because invoices hadn't generated, and no one could explain why. I closed the chat window without replying. I wasn't hiding, I just wasn't available. Inside the company, decisions started colliding with missing information. Finance pushed for approvals that never reached the next step. Sales promised confirmations that couldn't be produced. Support escalated tickets that had nowhere to land. Each group acted in isolation, assuming another team had visibility they no longer had. Meetings were scheduled, then rescheduled, then canceled when no one could answer the most basic question of whose numbers were correct. I could see the pattern from the outside because it was the same one I had spent years preventing. When systems that connect revenue streams lose alignment, the damage isn't loud at first, it's subtle. A delay here, a mismatch there, a report that doesn't tie out. Then it compounds. An executive presentation goes forward with partial data. A decision gets made on bad assumptions. Someone commits to a forecast that can't be met. By the time leadership realizes something fundamental is wrong, the problem has already spread across teams that don't speak the same operational language. The calls escalated. The tone changed from casual to careful, then to urgent. A voicemail from legal asked me to call back to clear up a misunderstanding. Another from my boss used my first name twice and said we should talk like adults. A third from an executive assistant referenced an emergency meeting and said my input would be valuable. I let them all stack up. I watched instead as approval queues grew longer, then stalled entirely. A renewal batch failed to finalize and rolled back without explanation. A billing run completed but never posted, leaving accounting with numbers that looked real until someone tried to reconcile them. Support agents told clients they were experiencing a temporary delay, while managers argued over whether to acknowledge an outage publicly. No announcement went out because no one wanted to own the problem. That hesitation cost them more than any system failure could. Internally, the scramble turned visible. People who had never attended revenue meetings before were suddenly added to threads they didn't understand. Leaders demanded summaries that contradicted each other. Someone attempted a manual override and made it worse, locking a process that required credentials no one else had. Another manager suggested rolling back to last month's configuration, unaware that the logic had already diverged. Each attempt to force progress created another bottleneck. From where I sat, it was clear the systems weren't broken. They were intact, consistent, and inaccessible by design. They were doing what any well-built structure does when authority is removed. They stopped. A formal request came through council proposing a discussion to ensure continuity for employees and clients. The response reiterated the same terms already sent and declined any informal engagement. That was the moment when the language shifted again. The next message acknowledged business risk. The one after that referenced investor concern. Then came the call that didn't go through council at all. An executive reached out directly, voice controlled but tight, asking whether I understood the severity of the situation. I said I did and reminded them that they had documentation outlining their obligations. The line went quiet for a beat too long. After that, messages started coming in waves. Some were angry, some were apologetic, some pretended we were still on the same side. None of them changed the reality unfolding inside the company. Numbers that once moved automatically now required explanations no one could give. Deadlines slipped, calls stacked, pressure rolled downhill. I didn't need to do anything to escalate it further. The structure was already tipping under its own weight. All I had done was step out of the way and let them experience the system the way it had always existed, without me absorbing the impact. The first direct call came from the top. Not through assistants or legal buffers, but from someone used to being answered immediately. The tone was measured, almost friendly, as if we were picking up a conversation that had paused rather than collapsed. I was told there had been a misunderstanding, that decisions had been made too quickly, that the company valued my contributions. I was asked what it would take to stabilize things. I asked whether the termination had been rescinded. The answer circled without landing. I was offered a meeting instead. I declined and referred them back to the notice already sent. The next attempt was more transactional. A senior leader laid out options as if reading from a menu. Returned to my role with a revised title, a salary adjustment framed as recognition, a promise that my reporting line would change. Each offer assumed the same thing, that I wanted my old position back with better terms. I responded with a single sentence explaining I was no longer interested in employment. The pause that followed carried more weight than anything said out loud. Pressure followed quickly. A message from legal warned of downstream impact on employees and clients, carefully worded to imply responsibility without stating it outright. Another suggested temporary access while negotiations continued. I pointed them back to the contract and the requirement to cease use. A different executive tried a softer approach, referencing my history at the company, the relationships I had built, the culture I had helped shape. I didn't engage. Those arguments relied on loyalty, and loyalty had already been tested and dismissed. The tone shifted again. The next call framed the situation as a risk to the business, then to shareholders, then to the market. I was asked if I understood what prolonged disruption could mean. I said I did and asked if they understood what termination without cause meant under the agreement they had signed. Silence followed, then a request to involve the board. That was the first time the conversation acknowledged reality. A board representative joined the next call, direct and efficient, asking me to state my terms clearly so they could evaluate options. I did. Continued access would require a licensing arrangement, monthly fees, non-exclusive rights, clear boundaries, ownership retained, no employment. The response was immediate resistance, not to the cost, but to the idea of non-exclusivity. I explained that exclusivity was incompatible with the risk I had just experienced. They asked whether I would reconsider. I said no. The conversation ended without resolution. The following messages were shorter, more urgent. Requests turned into deadlines. Deadlines turned into appeals. One executive admitted on a call that forecasts were being revised downward because revenue couldn't be confirmed. Another acknowledged that clients were asking questions no one could answer. I listened without commenting. When someone suggested that the situation could escalate publicly, I reminded them that transparency was a leadership choice they had already made when they terminated me over a policy violation. By the time the board reconvened, the framing had changed entirely. The question was no longer how to restore normal operations under the old structure, but how to secure access quickly under any structure that worked. A revised proposal came through accepting most terms, but asking for concessions on scope. I declined and restated the original offer. The response came back faster this time, stripped of negotiation language and focused on acceptance. They needed stability. They needed it now. I agreed to consider final terms once they confirmed acceptance in writing. When the confirmation arrived, concise and formal, I acknowledged receipt and outlined next steps. The leverage had done its work. They weren't asking me to come back anymore. They were asking permission. I joined the call knowing exactly who would be there because desperation changes guest lists. Faces filled the screen in tight, controlled frames. Some I recognized from leadership updates. Others I had only ever seen as names at the bottom of forwarded emails. The board member, who spoke first, didn't waste time on pleasantries. She asked my former boss to explain in plain language why a revenue strategist who controlled core systems had been terminated without a transition plan. He straightened in his chair and launched into policy language, discipline, standards, culture. Halfway through, she cut him off and asked him to explain how billing worked now. He tried to answer and failed. He gestured toward finance, then sales, then IT, each deflection landing flatter than the last. Someone asked how renewals were being processed. He said they were delayed. Someone else asked how delayed. He didn't know. Another voice asked whether invoices had posted that morning. Silence followed. The board member turned to me and asked if I could clarify what had stopped. I did briefly without jargon, describing money not moving, approvals not completing, and reports no longer matching reality. Then she asked the question no one else had wanted to say out loud: who approved the termination? My boss raised his hand. The room shifted. She asked what justification had been documented. He cited policy again. She asked whether performance had been an issue. He said no. She asked whether there had been prior warnings. He said no. She asked whether he understood the contract tied to the systems. He hesitated, then admitted he hadn't reviewed it closely. That admission hung in the air. Another board member leaned forward and asked whether anyone else had reviewed it. No one answered. The board member who had been leading the discussion exhaled slowly and asked my boss to explain how firing me over a minor violation aligned with risk management. He started to speak, then stopped, realizing there was no answer that didn't sound reckless. She thanked him for his honesty and asked him to mute his line. He did, eyes fixed on the screen, jaw tight. She turned back to me and acknowledged that the situation should never have escalated to this point. She said the company was exposed, credibility had taken a hit, and leadership accountability would be addressed internally. Then she asked if my terms still stood. I confirmed they did. She nodded once and said the board would accept them. Before the call ended, she unmuted my boss and informed him that his role would be reviewed immediately pending further action. He tried to speak, but she ended the discussion. The screen went dark one square at a time until only my reflection remained. A follow-up email arrived minutes later confirming acceptance and outlining next steps. Shortly after that, a message from HR announced leadership changes effective immediately, framed as part of a broader operational review. I didn't respond to either. I forwarded the confirmation to my attorney and waited for instructions. The humiliation wasn't loud. There was no shouting or dramatic confrontation. It was precise, public, and irreversible. He wasn't punished by anger or insult. He was undone by having to explain his decision in front of people who understood consequences. When the call ended, nothing needed to be said. The balance had already shifted. Once the agreement was finalized, everything slowed down in a way that felt deliberate instead of chaotic. Access was restored through credentials that no longer belonged to an employee, but to a vendor, governed by terms instead of expectations. The systems resumed their cycles without ceremony. Invoices completed, renewals processed, dashboards stabilized. Inside the company, the noise softened from panic to relief, and then to the quieter tension that follows a close call. I wasn't pulled into meetings or asked to justify decisions. Communication came through formal channels, scheduled and documented with scope clearly defined. That boundary mattered more than the money. For the first time, my work existed without someone standing between it and its value. Messages continued to arrive from people who hadn't reached out before. Some were polite congratulations, others were careful questions about availability, phrased as curiosity but loaded with intent. I didn't answer most of them right away. I took time to set things up properly. Paperwork filed, accounts opened, a structure built that didn't depend on permission. When I did respond, it was with clarity, not urgency. This is what I offer. This is how it works. This is the cost. Take it or don't. Inside the former company, changes rolled through quietly. Leadership updates referenced alignment and governance. A new review process was announced. Documentation became a priority. None of that required my input. My responsibility began and ended with delivering what had been agreed to. No more, no less. That distance made everything cleaner. There were no late-night calls framed as favors, no sudden requests slipped into casual conversations, no assumptions that my time was endlessly flexible. Every interaction had weight because it had structure. Outside of that relationship, new conversations started. A competitor wanted to know whether the systems could support a different pricing model. Another firm asked about rebuilding their revenue workflows from scratch. I evaluated each opportunity the same way, without attachment. Does it make sense? Does it respect my time? Does it move me forward? Walking away from employment didn't feel like a leap. It felt like closing a door that had already been cracked open by circumstance. The job title I once carried didn't come up anymore, and I didn't miss it. What mattered was control. Control over what I built. Control over how it was used. Control over when I said yes and when I didn't. The story that circulated inside the company shifted as well. At first, it was framed as an unfortunate misunderstanding, then as a lesson learned. Eventually, it became something people referenced quietly when policy discussions went too far. I didn't correct it or contribute to it. I had no reason to. The point had already been made. On my desk, where no one commented on what belonged there, I set my laptop down and reviewed the next proposal. It wasn't urgent. It didn't carry pressure. It was simply an option. That was the real change. Not revenge, not vindication, not even the outcome of the negotiation. It was the ability to choose without fear of being cut loose for the wrong reason. When I thought back to the moment everything started, it no longer felt sharp. It felt small, almost forgettable, which was exactly the point. Power doesn't always announce itself when it shifts. Sometimes it just settles where it should have been all along. I didn't win because I was loud or clever. I won because I was quiet, prepared, and patient long before that meeting ever happened. When my boss waved policy in my face and HR read from a script, the room felt small, but the emails, contracts, and screenshots I had kept were already doing the talking for me. Every ignored warning, every unanswered email, every approval pushed through without review became weight later when people who had never listened suddenly needed proof. I learned that power doesn't always show up as authority. Sometimes it sits in a folder you update at night or a clause you insist on adding when everyone tells you it's unnecessary. During the board call, I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I explained slowly what stopped working and why. Watching my boss fail to explain his own decision was uncomfortable, but it wasn't accidental. It was the result of years of documentation meeting one reckless meeting. That experience changed how I work and how I protect myself. I no longer rely on trust alone. I keep records. I summarize conversations. I send follow-ups. Not because I'm bitter, but because memory fades and paper doesn't. If I were giving advice to a friend, I'd say this: don't wait until you're humiliated to realize what you hold. Build quiet leverage while things are calm. Make your work traceable. Make decisions visible. And never assume competence sits higher just because a title does. Preparation isn't paranoia. It's self-respect earned over time. How to get started today. Save important emails and meeting notes in one place. After meetings, send short summaries confirming decisions. Read contracts carefully. Track approvals and changes, not just outcomes. Protect your work before someone questions it. Share this with someone.